Public Speaking, Chapter 3, Ethics in a Diverse Society. Free speech. It's the cornerstone of US society. The nation's founder knew that limiting our right to express ourselves freely would limit our ability to engage fully in a representative form of government. So they crafted the First Amendment to the Constitution to read: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to the petition the government for a redressing of grievances. This does not mean freedom of speech is total. We can't legally joke about hijacking in an airplane, and courts are increasingly ruling against hate speech, discriminatory language, or language intended to intimidate a person or group. Instead, we must balance our rights with our responsibilities into what Professor Werner Jensen calls our right stabilities. Jensen further defines ethical communication as the conscious decision to speak and listen in ways that you, in light of your cultural ideals, consider right, fair, honest, and helpful to others as well as yourself. Focusing on both rights and responsibilities brings up a number of ethical questions. On what basis should we determine right and wrong in public speaking and listening? Should some things be left unsaid? When? Who decides? What responsibilities do you have as a listener or as a researcher? This chapter presents some principles that have emerged from discussing these ethically challenging questions. We first examine common responses to diversity and then discuss guidelines for ethical speaking, listening, and researching in a complex culture. Responses to diversity. Diversity includes obvious differences such as language, ethnicity, religious beliefs, and practices, as well as conflicting opinions about political and social issues that can seem irrecognizable, leading to tensions that can overshadow the many things that might otherwise bind people together. However, diverse people and groups can and do come together in productive civil and ethical ways. Common responses to diversity include resistance, assimilation, and accommodation. Individuals and groups enact resistance in many forms. Some bolster and defend their beliefs and traditions, others withdraw from challenging situations, still others attack their opponents with mild challenges that ignore, discount, or ridicule divergent ideas or escalate to physical assaults that threats terrorism or armed conflicts. Resistors often attack with words. So much so that Deborah Tannen, a professor of linguistics, says we live in an argument culture. Tannen is especially sensitive to the war metaphors we use. For example, think about all the battle terms you hear: culture wars, fighting for your ideas, battleground states. We arm ourselves for arguments, we shoot down ideas, we target our political enemies. You will find dozens of additional examples. Resistance is not inherently bad. In many cases, both in the United States and around the world, conscientious resistance leads to positive outcomes. Protest movements and activists often confront social, environmental, and global injustice and bring about necessary reforms. However, activism that justifies using questionable means for a good cause has ethical implications. In assimilation, groups or individuals embrace new perspectives and lifestyles and reject or surrender some or most of their previous beliefs and actions. For example, a person might encounter religious diversity and convert to a different belief system, adopting a new religious vocabulary, new rituals, and changed concepts. Assimilation takes place over time and is rarely total. Because choice is a dominant US value, people are free to change their ideas and lifestyles, but ethical implications arises when individuals feel correct or manipulated into changing without critically examining good reasons for the change. Another approach, accumulation, involves adjustment or adaptation. Accommodating groups or individuals show a willingness to hear and evaluate diverse ideas with an open mind. They allow themselves to rethink their ideas and surrender some, modify others, and hold some relatively intact. Accommodation leads to the multivocal society that seeks out a variety of ideas, opinions, and visions and give them an open, recognized voice. Here, co cultural groups recognize their diversity yet work together to forge a civic culture that accommodates both differences and commonalities. However, accommodation has its challenges. Participating in this form of communication requires a set of abilities, the most important of which is remaining in the tension between holding your own perspective, being profoundly open to others who are unlike you, and enabling others to act similarly. Study Rodney Smoller's inaugural speech in Appendix B and notice the ways he calls for accommodation on the college campus where he is assuming the presidency. Resistance and accommodation have ethical implications. It is easy to label extreme forms of resistance or even taunting as unethical, but what about simply ignoring people who differ from you? What about cruel remarks in anonymous posts on internet sites? Your decision to resist new ideas or to embarrass them with relatively few questions, to block voices from being heard or to invite dialogue, all of these have ethical implications for both speaking and listening in a diverse society. Let's now turn to specific cultural resources that can help you to be a more ethical speaker. Speaking ethically. Your concern with ethics should begin as soon as you receive your speech assignment because you have responsibilities to your audience, your topic, and yourself. Ethical principles fall into two major categories, democratic and dialogically. NCA Radio for Ethical Communication. Questions of right and wrong arises whenever people communicate. Ethical communication is fundamental to responsible thinking, decision making, and the development of relationships and communities within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. Moreover, ethical communication enhances human worth and dignity by fostering truthfulness, fairness, responsibility, personal integrity, and respect for self and others. We believe that unethical communication threatens the quality of all communication and consequently the well being of individuals and the society in which we live. Therefore, we, the members of the National Communication Association, endorse and are committed to practicing the following principles of ethical communication. We advocate truthfulness, accuracy, honesty, and the reason as essential to the integrity of communication. We endorse freedom of expression, diversity of perspective, and tolerance of dissent to achieve the informed and responsible decision making fundamental to a civil society. We strive to understand and respect other communicators before evaluating and responding to their messages. We promote access to communication resources and opportunities as necessary to fulfill human potential and contribute to the well being of families, communities, and society. We promote communication climates of caring and mutual understanding that respect the unique needs and characteristics of individual communicators. We condemn communication that degrades individuals and humanity through distortion, intimidation, coercion, and violence, and through the expression of intolerance and hatred. We are committed to the courageous expression of personal convictions in pursuit of fairness and justice. We advocate sharing information, opinions, and feelings when facing significant choices while also respecting privacy and confidentiality. We accept responsibility for the short and long term consequences for our own communication and expect the same from others. Practice democratic principles. In society, we discuss issues of concern to individuals, the nation, and the world in face to face meetings through the media and on the internet. The variety and amount of available opinions call for citizens who can think carefully about matters that affect our nation and world. Develop a habit of research. Because you are your audience's primary source of information during your speech, you owe to it to your listeners to know what you are talking about. So it is important to do your homework beforehand. Don't just settle for a surface understanding of the topic. Instead, examine a variety of credible resources and search for diverse viewpoints from supporters as well as critics. Make sure your position is well reasoned. Present a variety of perspectives to give your listeners the breadth of information they need to form their own conclusions. This approach contrasts with the argumentative mentality that Deborah Tanyan says obscures the complexity of research and creates oversimplifications, disinformation, and distortion of issues. Be honest and fair. Present your information truthfully. Don't exaggerate a problem to make it seem greater than it is actually is. Don't distort or twist evidence. Statistics can be particularly misleading, also find out as much as you can about the numbers you present. Strive for fairness, balance, and even handedness rather than simply giving the side that favors your position. Practice civility. Civility is a social virtue grounded in country. Civil speakers and listeners are more than simply polite. They choose to pursue, consult, advise, bargain, compromise, and build coalitions. Civility accommodates diverse opinions by striving for understanding, appreciating opposing perspectives, and accepting the possibility of losing the argument. Cultures from the ancient Greeks to modern Asian societies have promoted civility as an ethical principle. President Obama called for civility in a speech after yet another deadly shooting. At a time when our discourse has become so sharp polarized, it's important for us to pause for a moment and make sure that we are talking with each other in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. As we discuss these issues, let each of us do so with a good dose of humility rather than pointing fingers or assigning blame. Let's use this occasion to expand our moral imagination, to listen to each other more carefully, to sharpen our instincts for empathy, and remind ourselves of all the ways that our hopes and dreams are bounded together. Habits of research, honesty, fairness, and civility. These are by no means all of the democratic principles related to public speaking. However, this list gives you some specific ways to think about ethical speaking. Since diversity is pervasive in our society, you must create your own way to best respect cultural differences. Does Facebook encourage civility? Communication researchers are currently exploring ways that digital media help or hinder high school and college students' civic engagement and involvement in issues of public concern. Early studies are finding that online groups based on common interest are not just echo chambers that only reinforce the participants' views. Instead, the more time students spend in online groups, the more exposure they have to diverse perspectives. Compared with youth who don't participate in online groups, these students are more likely to volunteer, give to charitable cause, and express their opinions about community issues. Use dialogical principle. A dialogical perspective is not a set of rules, instead, it is a mindset linked to cultural values of honesty, openness, and freedom of choice. Taking a dialogical perspective can help you be more ethical as a speaker and listener. In The Magic of Dialogue, Transforming Conflict into Cooperation, Daniel Yankovic identifies three essential components of dialogue: equality, empathy, and examination. Equality means you and your listeners respect each other and regard each other's opinion as important enough to consider. Empathy means you show compassion and a willingness to identify emotionally with others in an attempt to understand others' perspectives. Examination means you put aside a know it all aptitude and willingly scrutinize both your assumptions and those of others with an open mind. You may never agree with some people, or you might eventually persuade them to adopt your views. This perspective also helps create a multivocal society. What does it look like in practice? Amitai Atijani, who experienced Nazi's persecution during his childhood, emphasizes both rights and responsibilities in the principles he proposes for discussion involving major differences. Don't demonize the other side or only show it negatively. Second, don't insult or offend the deep moral commitments of others. Don't bring up dark moments from our group's tree. Third, talk less about non negotiable rights and more about negotiable needs, wants, and interests. Fourth, don't feel you must deal with every issue. You can let some things drop. Fifth, don't abandon your convictions but balance your beliefs and passions against those strongly held by others. Dialogue can help resolve international, national, and campus problems. For example, groups such as the Difficult Dialogues initiatives provide space for people from various perspectives to come together in reasoned dialogue about controversial issues. On campus, the Democracy Project develops intentionally designed permanent spaces on campuses for identifying, studying, deliberating, and planning action regarding pressing issues with ethical or social implications. Listening ethically. You don't have time to listen to every person or every idea, but polite listening affirms another person's right to speak, and your respectful attention is one way to empower others. Think about how positive you feel when someone who disagrees with you still takes time to ask how you come to your conclusions. Sincere questions that are not meant as personal attacks show that the listener is really trying to understand your viewpoint. Some situations pose ethical dilemmas for listeners. For example, when you hear someone saying something you know to be false or arguing for a viewpoint that does not seem well reasoned, what should you do? Should you respectfully confront the speaker in front of others? Should you prepare another speech to present more accurate information or provide a different perspective? Should you ask questions that help others listeners detect the misinformation or bias? Should you disrupt the speech by heckling, by interrupting or shouting down the speaker? These are all possible responses. Classroom listening also has an ethical implications. Have you been in a class situation where disruptive or impolite students caused you stress and as a result you got less out of the session? For example, students who challenge the instructor or other students with whom they disagree can make a learning situation stressful and difficult. Nowadays, many universities are addressing classroom incivility, defined as actions that interfere with the students' overall learning. In addition to disruptive challenges, annoying behaviors such as arriving late and leaving early, noisily packing up before class ends, texting, reading others' materials, surfing the internet, or having side conversations may seem relatively minor, but they can add up to create a climate that interferes with both your and other students' ability to listen and learn. Interestingly, one professor who taught in both face to face and online formats reported that student feedback on controversial topics differed in these two formats. In classroom discussions, students were often sarcastic, disrespectful, and dismissive of opposite opinions. However, in online forums, Students typically give professional and mature feedback, perhaps because they took time to evaluate their reasoning before they submit a post. You can follow the principle for ethical feedback by holding yourself accountable for through thoughtful but civil responses to ideas that conflict with yours. To evaluate your ethical responsibilities as a listener, ask yourself these questions. Do I keep myself informed about significant issues by exposing myself to a number of arguments? Or do I listen only to the side with which I already agree? In short, do I listen with an open mind? Do I fulfill my ethical responsibilities to other listeners by not distracting them? Do I fulfill my responsibilities to the speaker by letting them know they are being heard? Do I encourage speakers to meet ethical standards? This may mean that I ask for further information about their sources or that I point out relevant information they omit. Do I evaluate my feedback to make sure my responses are civil and well reasoned? Academic honesty. Curry's introduction was fine until she got to her these statements. The National Collegiate Athletic Association is the main governing body of the collegiate sports where students took to further their athletic careers. Today I will share with you the rule I would like to see changed, and that is athletic scholarship for Division 3rd schools. The professor thought, wait a minute. I don't assign a change or rule speech, but my colleague down the hall does. A quick check with them turned up an identical opening submitted by a student in another class. Carrie's speech was plagiarized. She admitted that she had changed a couple of lines, but basically she had given her friend's speech. Taylor failed to cite sources in her speech, and on her PowerPoint slides, in a speech about drug cartels, Aaron made up a statistic, an act of fabrication, a second type of ethical breach. Plagiarism and fabrications are specific ethical violence, punishable by a failing grade, being fired from a job, and sometimes public humiliation. To avoid ethical problems with plagiarism or fabrications, it is important to understand what they are. Avoid plagiarism. Your degree is your college or university official recognition and certification that you have personally learned the concepts and practice skills associated with your degree. Because students' learning is their purpose for existing, colleges and universities crack down on plagiarism. They reason that when you plagiarize, you don't personally do the work. Instead, you present others' people ideas, words, or works as their own without giving credit to the source. It would be somewhat that like sending your roommate to the weight room to do your weight training. You don't benefit from the exercise. Furthermore, it is not fair to your classmates who are doing the work. The internet makes plagiarism easier than ever because it is so simple to access and download others people material. Consequently, someone who would never consider ripping a paragraph out of a New York Times column or cutting a sentence out of Sports Illustrated and gluing it onto an outline find it easy to cut and paste the same material from those sources online into a computer document. To many people, electronically stored material is easier to conceptualize as somehow different in kind from hard copies of the same content. To avoid plagiarism, you should understand its various forms. Deliberate fraud happens when students knowingly and intentionally borrow, buy, or steal someone else's speech or outline and present it as their own work. Because Kyrie's speech on changing a rule mentioned earlier was deliberately borrowed, she was subject to her university harsh penalties for plagiarism, which included an F on the assignment and a letter placed in a file in the dean's office. Cut and paste plagiarism is when plagiarists copy entire sentences or paragraphs word for word from an article or articles and piece them together, onto an outline of speech. They omit question marks around the copied words and fail to cite the sources in the speech or next to the material on the outline, even though they may supply a list of resources at the end of the outline. Improper paraphrases means changing words or moving phrases around but keeping the basis, organization, structure, and ideas of the original intact. Although these plagiarizers might list all sources in a reference list, they fail to credit the source next to the paraphrased material itself. Plagiarism can be intentional or accidental. Accidental plagiarists don't intend to cheat, but they fail to properly paraphrase or give credit to their sources. Intentional or not, the consequences can be serious. For example, Alison created a series of PowerPoint slides with pictures she had downloaded from the internet without creating the websites where she found the pictures. However, it never occurred to her that she should cite the source of a photograph. Accidental though it was, she was held responsible for knowing the rule relating to plagiarism, which are easily available. Where are these rules? Your university library campus writing center provides guidelines for source citations. Here are examples from Purdue University Online Writing Lab. Give credit whenever you use somebody else's words, ideas, or creative works directly, whether you take them from library resources, the internet, films, or television shows, audio recordings, advertisements, letters from friends, or elsewhere. Provide sources for information learned in interviews, conversations, or mail. Tell your audience the source of unique words and the phrases that are not your own. Identify the sources of diagrams, illustrations, charts, photographs, and figures. You do not need to document personal experiences, observations, conclusions, or insights. Results of experiments you personally conduct, common knowledge, including folklore or tradition within your culture group, such as Cinderella or Robin Hood. Generally accepting facts, the kind of information every source provides for information your audience already knows or easily finds in reference material. For example, numerous sources say Presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 4th of July in 1826. So, citing a source may be unnecessary. To be on the safe side, however, the Writing Center at the University of North Carolina counsels you to cite information that is new to you. Maybe everyone knows that date of Adams and Jefferson, but if you first learn it in a specific history book, cites that source. Sources can be either published or unpublished. Of course, books and magazines are considered publications, but so are paintings, websites, and movies or audio recordings. Unpublished sources include letters and mails, speeches, personal interviews, personal photographs, class lectures, notes, and handouts, even papers you have submitted for another class. To avoid plagiarism, name each source as you deliver your speech. For example, when you use a direct quotation introduced in as such, when you paraphrase someone else's idea, cite the originator. When you present a diagram or a chart on a visual, write the source somewhere on the visual or on the reference list at the end of the presentation. Here are some specific examples of how speakers cited sources. Published source journals. Products can be added to shows even after they have initially aired. In a February 1, 2008 article in Teacher Librarian, Kate McPherson reported that a scene from the Friends sitcom originally showed Ross sitting at a bare table. Now, at a rerun, shows a package of Oreo cookies in front of him. Published source internet. To cite the source of a visual, Jitong provide information in a very small font beside the image. Alternatively, she could have created a reference list at the end of a series of visuals citing the source for each image used. Unpublished source personal conversations. The other day, my friend Glenn Bassner told me that everything we have learned about financing films over the last 15 years we have to forget. Chapter 11 describes ways to document sources on your outline. Be sure to list your references at the end using a standard format such as MLA Modern Language Association style or APA American Psychological Association style. Look for the latest version of these styles manuals and others that are available on the internet or in the reference section of your library. They show you how to cite just about any source, from a book to a personal letter, from a DVD to a website. Many articles in your library database also show how to cite the article in a variety of formats, although you should check each citation to make sure it meets your instructor criteria. Avoid fabrication. Plagiarism is only one form of academic dishonesty. Another is fabrication, which happens if you make up information or guess at numbers but present them as factual. Fabrication has serious consequences. For instance, a well known researcher faked scientific data linking autism to vaccine. He was eventually disgraced, but not until the information was widely disseminated, frightening many parents away from vaccinating their children. Until he was exposed, students had no way of knowing that his data were falsified, and many used them in their speeches on childhood vaccination. After the news broke, however, the truth became widely available to everyone who double checked the facts, and the speaker who continued to pass on the fake data as true can be held liable. Citing a reference you did not actually read or passing along rumors or other unsubstantiated information are types of fabrication common in public speeches. Rumors, especially about politicians or celebrities or sports figures, sweep across internet blogs, mails, talk radio, and whispered conversations. However, accurate information should be available to those willing to search for it. The best ways to avoid fabrication are to use a number of sources and to be alert for conflicting data. Thoroughly check out your information before you present it as factual. If something seems suspicious, don't use it. Many internet sites exist to uncover hoaxes and false claims and to expose urban legend of all kinds. Plagiarism and culture. Individualistic culture like the United States considered plagiarism to be a serious intellectual breach. First, writing something down is thought to be a concrete way to demonstrate your knowledge and skills. Turning in someone else's work does not show your own, you know. Second, because individualists emphasize you should develop yourself to your highest potential and do creative, original thinking. Turning in someone else's work does not demonstrate your originality. Finally, the cultural notion of personal property includes ownership of intellectual property. You can patent, copyright, or sell your ideas, creations, musical works, unique words, and writings because they are legally yours. Thus, if someone else use your all or part of your original work without giving you credit, you can charge the person with stealing your intellectual property. In contrast, collectivist culture view intellectual property differently. In a society that value the group over the individual, words and ideas can belong to the culture as a whole, not to a single person. Would stealing or painting, pirating works be viewed with the same perspective? What might happen if a business headquartered in the United States moved into such a culture? Also consider the impact of the internet on the notion of ownership of words and ideas. For example, through hypertext, people can write collaboratively and use non-linear connections to create products that show few indications of who said what. Wikipedia is just one example of a jointly created resources. Who really owns a Wikipedia entry? If you find two or more websites with identical information, who originated the material? As you present your materials, be sure to cite your references and check a variety of resources to avoid the ethical problems of plagiarism and fabrication. Chapter 4, Effective Listening. An ancient proverb emphasizes the comparative importance of listening. We have been given 2 ears but a single mouth in order that we may hear more and talk less. Unfortunately, we often focus less on developing our listening competencies than on overproving our reading, writing, and speaking skills. Listening is more than simply hearing. I can hear traffic outside, a door slamming down the hall, rain against the window. That is, my ears pick up those sounds, but I am not listening to them. Listening is an active mental process in which you interrupt messages to understand and respond to them. It takes motivation, effort, and concentration. Listening has at least 5 elements: receiving sounds, discriminating or distinguishing among them, focusing attention, assigning meaning to the sounds, and then remembering the information. In contrast, something that goes in our ear and out the other is hearing. Because listening is so vital in many areas of life, this chapter first illustrated its importance and then looks at some factors that typically hinder effective listening. Finally, it presents strategies you can use to become a more effective listener. Listening skills are valuable. A recent internet search for listening skills linked to almost half a billion sites offering workshops, quizzes, advice, and activities that can improve listening in workplaces, in classrooms, and relationships. Obviously, people definitely see room for improvement and they value good listening for many reasons. Listening takes up much of our time. Listening is the most commonly used skill in the workplace. Understanding and following instructions come in second. Furthermore, the average student spends 14 hours each week listening in class, and this is over and above the hours spent listening to friends and to media. Good listening skills are good job skills. In one study, 80% of executives ranked as listening as the most important work skill. Other researchers found that the physicians with good listening skills had fewer malpractice claims. And Madeline Borley, Allen, author of The Listening, the Forgotten Skill, says the most common comment about well liked bosses is, he or she listens to me. In occupation as diverse, a dental hygienist, interior designer, roofing contractor, tax preparer, journalist, and politician, good listening makes a difference, President Calvin Coolidge once called. No one ever listened himself out of a job. In short, the most successful people are generally effective listeners. Good listening skills are good academic skills. Researchers administered a listening test to all incoming students at one university. At the end of the 5 years, 49% of the low scoring listeners were on academic probation compared to less than 5% of high scores. In contrast, 68.5% of high scoring listeners were earning honors compared to just over 4% of low scorers. You have an investment in the listening situation. One university counseling service advises students to develop a positive consumer wise attitude towards listening. The fact that you are in a particular listening situation means you have something at stake. Choosing to listen carefully and benefit from what you hear will help you gain the most from your time. These are only a few reasons that listening is important. You can probably think of many other ways that good listening makes life easier. Pause now and ask yourself how your listening habits help or hinder your comprehension of coursework. How are listening skills used in a job you currently hold or plan to hold somebody? Keep these questions in mind as you study the remainder of the chapter. Barrier to listening. The Chinese character for listening combines the symbols for ears, eyes, and ear. It reinforces the idea that good listeners are wholly involved in listening. Most likely, you intend to listen well, but linguistic, culture, and personal barriers can hinder your effectiveness. Understanding the barriers and planning strategies to deal with them will build your listening skills. Linguistic barriers. Sometimes a speaker language creates a barrier because diverse culture includes many language variations. Linguistic barriers show up in both language and vocabulary differences. Language differences. Obviously, When you don't share a speaker's language, you won't understand without an interpreter. Even then, you will probably miss some concepts or nonsense of meaning because languages and the ideas they embody are so different. In addition, you may find it hard to figure out words when a person speaks with a heavy accent, whether the accent is regional, ethnic, or influenced by a first language. Vocabulary differences. Speakers with a more extensive vocabulary than yours may not talk over your head. In addition, speakers who use technical jargon associated with a specific topic such as medicine or engineering will lose law audiences unless they translate the terminology. And a speaker who use slang or other specialized linguistic codes will reach some people but talk past others. Finally, a speaker can say a word, even one as simple as Texas, that listener understand differently because each person has different ideas about and experiences with Texas. The exact meanings are in people illustrate this. To overcome linguistic barriers, pay carefully attention and try to figure out specific words from the general context of the speech. Listen for the main points, take notes, and jot down words to look up later. Speakers can help by translating jargon or slang, explaining confusing words, and displaying words visually so that listeners can see as well as hear what they are saying. Cultural barriers. Your ability to understand culture alludes reference to culture specific historical, literary, and religious sources. Also affects your comprehension. You can probably think of many familiar things in your culture and co-cultures that would confuse someone from a different group. Here are a few examples. A Protestant or non-religious person might be clueless about the Catholic Eucharist. Most people in the United States would not recognize allusions to the classic Japanese novel The Tale of Genji. Although he is one of the most famous African writers, many US audiences would need an introduction to Nege wa Thingo. In our pluralistic society and multicultural world, each group draws from different cultural resources. Audiences may be unfamiliar with these culture specific references, so each speaker should be sensitive to potential differences and explain allusions and choose areas of common knowledge. Listeners can also play their part by jotting down unfamiliar allusions and looking them up later. Personal barriers. Personal issues can also obstruct your listening. Physical factors such as hearing loss, sleep deprivation, hunger pangs, or illness can affect your ability or your desire to pay attention. Psychological factors such as an argument with a friend or a huge test coming up in your next class can lessen your motivation to listen. You may also experience receiver apprehension RA if you fear you will misinterpret, inadequately process, or fail to adjust psychologically to a message that threatens or negatively challenges you. And you may struggle to stay focused if you lack interest in the topic or find it difficult to understand. Stereotypes and prejudice can also hinder listening. Stereotyping puts people into a category and then assumes that they fit the characteristic of the category. Showing prejudice or bias means listening to topics or speakers with profound judgments, whether negative or positive. To illustrate, supporters of gay marriage listened enthusiastically to a marriage equality advocate, but they approached a defense of marriage speaker with suspicion and vice versa. Because listening requires attention, maintaining focus is a major component. However, attention constantly fluctuates, as this student explained. I am easily distracted. It is easy for me to either focus on one particular thing that has been said and then sort to off drift off, exploring it further in my own mind, or and this implies more specifically to someone whose speaking style or subject does not impress me. Float off on unrelated topics. Also, depending on the subject, I can get easily bored. Paying attention can be hard partially because you can think far more rapidly than the fastest speaker can talk. Most people average about 150 words per minute, leaving you with 350 words per minute of a speech thought differential. The following four thought patterns are common during listening. Taking small departures from the communication line. Small departures can distract and hinder your comprehension, but they can also help you follow a message if you use them to produce your own examples. Relate the material to your personal experiences, answer the speaker rhetorical questions, and otherwise interact with the ideas during the departure. Going off on a tangent. When you leave the speaker's line of thinking and seize on to the idea, taking it in your own direction, your attention is deflected and you stop listening. One distracting thought leads to another, and before you know it, you have several subjects removed from the topic at hand. Engaging in a private argument. If you carry on a running debate or mental argument that parallels a speech, you close your mind and stop trying to understand the speaker's reasoning. You to counter this, identify arguments that don't make sense but withhold your final judgment until you have heard the entire speech. Taking large departures from the communication line. Here your attention wanders off into unrelated areas. You bring it back and focus on the speech for a while, then off it goes again and you find yourself thinking about a totally unrelated topic. This cycle repeats indefinitely. In summary, linguistic, culture, and personal factors can challenge your listening competencies. To assess your skills, complete the listening skills self assessment in your online resources. To improve your skills, use some of the tips described throughout the remainder of this chapter. Strategies to improve listening. Margaret Enfoff, past president of the International Listening Association, says that students do not usually think of listening as an active process they can control. Instead, they find it easier to criticize the speaker, mannerism, and characteristics rather than critically analyze the message. This section presents some of her suggestions for improving listening skills. Develop advanced skills. Throughout each day, you have listening goals. Whether or not you think about them, you watch TV for entertainment, but when a commercial comes on, you might tune out or you might evaluate the claims, deciding whether or not the product is worth buying. You listen to a lecture for information and then you eat lunch with friends and listen empathically to their frustrations. For each type of listening, you shift strategies to meet your goals. Different goals requires different competencies, ranging from basic to advanced levels. On the basic level, we listen to the message rather mindlessly, relying on culture, script, prior knowledge, past experiences, and like to guide our understandings. For example, when a friend vents, you have in mind a script for venturing that allows you to listen and respond empathetically. But more complex messages such as lectures or political speeches need more mindful attention and requires more cognitive effort to analyze and reflect on the message. This section focuses on ways to develop advanced and listening skills for comprehending and evaluating messages. Improve your comprehension. Listening with the purpose of understanding information, also known as a comprehensive listening, is useful every day. Your professor clarifies a complex process, your boss gives directions for your next project, your physicians explain your medical conditions, a reporter tells where the accident blocked traffic. Several strategies can help you learn more competently. Prepare in advance. Before the session, ask some pre questions such as what do I already know about this topic, what do I want to know, what do I need to know. Your answers to these questions can help you set learning goals. Before a classroom session, review notes from previous sessions and then study the text. Nothing highlighted concept, key terms, and the headings. Read the chapter summary, look at the pictures and diagrams, or search the internet for supplementary or background information. In the workplace, do your homework beforehand by brushing up on background information. This will help you ask more thoughtful questions. Use attention directing strategies. Taking notes is a common attention directing strategies. Focus on particular areas of the message. For example, listen for and write down the main ideas. List practical things I must remember or note examples that will help you recall the concepts. Jot down unfamiliar words to look up later. Use what you know about speech organization to help you remember material. For instance, signals such as first, next, or finally can help you identify a series of steps. Be alert for words that connect ideas such as therefore or in contrast. Remember your goals. It is easier to pay attention when you consider your investment in the topic. For instance, a lecture on antimony may seem boring, but the information is essential in many careers. So try to reframe your attitude about uninteresting material. Think of positive things about the topic and how the information can be of use. In the classroom, try to anticipate what might be on a test. In the workplace, look for the main things your boss wants you to remember. Use elaboration strategies. Link the material to yourself in ways that enhance the meaning. Create mental images or refer to what you already know or have experienced. For example, you might ask questions like, who do I know who is like that? What comes next? Such this match what I learned in another context. How does this relate to things I'm doing now? Use strategies that complement your learning style. If you are an auditory learner and your instructor use lecture capture technology to upload class materials into digital formats, you can review them on demand, or you might ask permission to tape the lecture and discussion. Replaying complex subjects can be especially helpful. You can skim over parts you understand easily and then replay the parts that are more difficult. If you are a linear learner, outline the main points and the important supporting information. If you are more graphically oriented, make a mind map and draw connections between ideas or sketch useful illustrations in the margins of your notes. I like to include the speaker's example in my notes because I learn and remember abstract ideas better when I can tie them to real life situations. Don't get hung up on delivery. Some speakers with important things to say have annoying delivery habits that can take your focus off the main idea. In summary, comprehensive listening corresponds with the journal speech purpose of informing. Listening to learn requires advanced skills of understanding words and ideas, identifying major ideas and supporting materials, connecting new material with the old, and recalling information. We now turn to critical listening skills that you should put into practice when you hear a persuasive speaker. Cultural listening styles. Listeners from various culture groups approach public speeches in ways that reflect their group's different worldviews and listening behaviors. Knowing some culture variation will make you more mindful of listening diversity. Here are a few examples. Culture schemas. These are culturally developed mental plans, blueprints, or models that help the group members perceive information and then interpret, store, and recall it. For example, Native Americans from the Tlingit tribe have different schemas for Telugu stories and Chekalnik tales. African American schemas. The entire audience participates in a call and response pattern that reflects African traditions. The speaker's statements are punctuated by the listener reactions to them, and in a real sense, the audience talks back to the speaker. No sharp line distinguishes speakers and listeners, and everyone cooperates to create the message. Asian cultural listening tradition. Culture that emphasizes unity often expects speaker to develop oneness with listeners rather than present divisive ideas. Both speaker and listeners share responsibility for making the speech successful. Some audiences remain silent, thinking that noise breaks their concentration and diverts their attention. Applause signals suspicion. Similar to booing by US audiences, some cultures do not even applaud at the end of the speech, which allows the speaker to remain modest. Various student preferences across culture Various student preferences. A cross cultural study of student listening preferences showed that American students tend to like short to the point message given by speakers with whom they can identify. Disorganized presentation frustrate and annoy German students who are much less concerned about identifying personally with the speaker. Think about your personal listening preferences. How are they shaped by your culture background? Improve your critical listening skills. Persuasive messages surround you, urging you to buy, sign up, donate, vote, change your beliefs, and so on. Consequently, critical listening skills help you sort through competing claims for your allegiance, your beliefs, your money, and your time. A critical approach means that you use advanced listening skills to analyze evidences, ponder implications, and evaluate merits of various appeals rather than accept them unreflectively. Critical listening builds on comprehension listening skills but add questions such as these. What is this speaker goal? Is this speaker trustworthy? Is he or she knowledgeable about this topic? Does this message make sense? Where does the supporting information come from, and those sources reliable? What will I gain or lose if I adopt these ideas? What problems, if any, go along with this position? Am I being unduly swayed by my emotion? Critical listening is your response to the speaker's general purpose to persuade. These skills help you live out the cultural saying, don't believe everything you hear, and the principles guide you as you sift through all the persuasive appeals each brings. In a diverse culture, it is psychologically rewarding to seek out speakers who bolster and affirm your ideas, especially if the dominant society challenges them. The following examples may clarify this concept. Religious adherents gather regularly in churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples to reaffirm their beliefs. People who have strong political learning assemble to hear passionate speeches that reinforces their ideologies. Every January 22, the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, supporters on both sides of the abortion issue attend rallies to hear speakers reaffirm their respective positions. In a similar context, you might find yourself clapping, nodding, or verbally encouraging speakers who affirm your basis. In fact, you might not notice questionable arguments or emotional appeals. However, you should submit all persuasive messages to critical evaluation, even those that reinforce positions you support. Practice dialogical listening. Remember the communication model introduced in chapter 1 because communication involves active participation from listeners and speaker alike. Your feedback helps co create the meanings that ultimately come out of the communication event. Feedback can come in the non-verbal, verbal, or written messages. As you read the suggestions that follow, remember the cultural expectations affect what are considered appropriate feedback behaviors. Give appropriate nonverbal feedback. Your postures, movements, and eye contact, even the distance you sit from the speaker, are all ways to provide meaningful feedback. Postures. Postures communicates involvement. Being on the edge of a seat means you are thoroughly engrossed, and a posture that faces the speaker squarely and leans slightly forward can help focus your attention. Even if you sit in a corner or off to the side, you can still turn in the direction of the speaker and let your body assume an open position. Eye contact. Watch the speaker instead of looking at another distraction. This not only helps maintain attention, it also establishes rapport and lets the speaker gauge your interest and comprehension. Distance. Think about the difference in your attentiveness when you sit far from the speaker versus when you sit closer to the presenter, where you have fewer distractions. Which seat contributes more to good listening? Choosing to sit where the speaker can really make eye contact with you puts more pressure on you to pay attention and give non-verbal feedback. Movements. Avoid distracting behaviors such as fidgeting, shuffling papers, or playing with your pen. Instead, give non-verbal feedback in the form of smiles at amusing anecdotes or notes in support of a major points to further increase your involvement and provide additional interaction with the presenter. Attentive listeners may actually help the speaker become more interesting. An old campus legend tells of a boring professor who always stood at the lectern and read his notes. His student decided to act as if he were fascinating. Whenever he moved away from the lectern, if he moved ever so slightly, they all leaned forward a bit, made eye contact, and gave supportive feedback. According to the legend, the professor eventually was walking back and forth across the front of the room, speaking animatedly. Give verbal feedback. Where can I get more information? One article I read presented very different information. How is he defining that word? Questions and comments such as these arise as you listen. Questions and answer periods provide opportunities to co create meanings. Here are a few of the most common types of feedbacks. If you are confused, ask clarification questions to gain more information. Examples: could you go over that third step again? What's your threshold level for poverty? Closed question asks for brief, specific answers. Use them to gain precise information or to verify your understanding. Here are some examples. Did you watch the documentary about dolphins? When was that law passed? Open questions invite longer answers that could be developed in a variety of ways, as these examples show. What do you think is the best new source of energy? What suggestions do you have for recycling old cell phones? What is your personal plan for paying off your student loans? Loaded questions put a speaker on the defensive because of what they imply. Try to avoid them. For example, when will you begin to look at both sides of the issues implies that the speaker was one sided, and when is not really asking for a time. In other words, you wouldn't expect to hear, I'm going to research the other side tomorrow afternoon at 3. To get a speaker to expand on an idea, make a request for elaboration. You said the Electoral College was modeled on the system used in the Roman Republic. Could you elaborate? Can you provide more details about the university plan to expand its online offerings? Instead of questions, you can add comments or information from your own experiences and research. For instance, after a speech on bullying, Tiffany shared statistics she had heard on a television show, and June told story about a coach who bullied his team. If you know the data in the speech are incorrect, you can provide supplementary information. Although question and answer periods are common in the United States, and not all culture participates equally in a co-creation of meaning process, as diversity in practice saving face explains. Give written feedback. You may be asked to write a response to a classmate's speech. Just writing I liked your speech is too vague to be helpful. More effective comments focus on specific elements using the DRE method. Describe, respond, evaluate. Describe what you heard. Respond with your personal interpretation and reaction. And evaluate by critiquing what you found effective and what could be improved. Phrase your comments objectively and positively. Here are some examples. Description: you use quotations from experts on both sides of this controversial issues. Your signpost and tradition statement clarified your main points. You touched your hair several times as you spoke. Response: I really connected emotionally with the story about the grandfather and the little boy. Because you alliterated your main points, I will be able to remember your ideas better. Evaluation: using a variety of sources was good because it showed you shout out opinions from many perspectives. Your use of examples balanced the statics well. I think your speech would be stronger if you added a map to your visuals. Your ability to remember your ideas was impressive, but try to eliminate the phrase I found it distracting. Specific comments such as these are beneficial because they give the speaker an idea of the overall impression the speech made on you and why. In general, write out as many positive things as you can and then evaluate the performance by identifying a few